So, hi, welcome, I'm Pettifor. Welcome to Hubscene, which is our German podcast for new political alternatives.
Right.
Trying to fight the fight to show that there are different ways of doing things. And we're very, very welcome. You're here visiting Germany.
Yes.
The lands, which probably more than any other, has pushed austerity, saving money, not going into debt as, you know, the alternative, in spite of being 80% of GDP. And you're here, and we're very, very keen just to hear, especially from you, because you are one of the initial initiators of today's big buzzword, the Green New Deal, back in 2008.
Yes, that's right.
I think yesterday there was a launch of a new campaign, Labour Green New Deal, in the UK.
Mm-hmm.
We've got DiEM25, Yanis Varoufakis, pushing a European New Deal in European elections.
Yeah.
We've got the fantastic Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez in the United States, causing huge waves.
Yeah.
What is a Green New Deal?
Right. Well, can I first of all say how wonderful it is to be here? I've got deep prejudices about the German attitude to economics, and my prejudices were challenged most ferociously last year when I was awarded the Hannah Arendt Prize.
Right.
And to my utter astonishment, I found that there were German Keynesians, and that there were people in Germany who don't share Mr. Schäuble's view, or who were not the Swabian housewives. So, you know, I know that there's potential in Germany for thinking about these things very seriously and for transformation. And I've come, you know, because for me, Germany has experience that demonstrates to me that it is possible to implement a Green New Deal, because too many people are saying to us, Steve, that actually this is utopian, we can't do it, we haven't got the time, there's only 10 years, we're told, by the IPCC. This is all, we don't have any money, how can you pay for it, how can you get people to change overnight, etc., etc. And I've been thinking up examples of how we've transformed economies overnight. And there is no more powerful example than the reunification of Germany. You know, what happened here was a transformation of a whole state, and indeed a sort of kind of global transformation as well, because of course it was about the collapse of the Soviet Union as well. I'm not saying that it was good, that it all worked out well.
There are some people in East Germany who I think
yes,
still
of course.
not entirely satisfied with that.
No, but what it tells me is that politicians and people are capable of making very big decisions which are transformational.
Right.
You know, we have other examples. We have Roosevelt in 1933, who on the night of his inauguration, and this inspires me enormously, on the night of his inauguration decided that the United States was going to dismantle the gold standard, which was this barbaric relic that was committed, if you like, to fiscal consolidation around the world and to forcing countries into austerity. And his officials said to him, well, you know, you can't do it tonight. And he said, well, we'll do it tomorrow. And they said, no, you can't do it on Sunday because that's a holy day. And he said, oh, damn, we're going to have to wait till Monday morning. And so on Monday morning, he said to the bankers, hand over your gold to the Federal Reserve. And he said to the American citizens, bring your gold and give it to the Federal Reserve. We're no longer basing the currency, the United States currency, on this barbaric relic. Now, you know, many historic interpretations of what he did suggest that all he did was to fix the banks. No, he didn't. He dismantled the globalized financial system, and he did that in a very short period with political will. So I'm here because I think we are capable of undertaking radical transformational change, and that we've got to do that because the weather that we're enduring and the extreme weather events that we're seeing in Africa right now command us to think about that transformation.
So what would the Green New Deal actually involve? Before we get to the whole financing,
yes,
what would happen?
So it's in first instance, it would dismantle the international financial system. In the first instance, we would have to dismantle globalization because we would need to transform the economy away from financialization and consumption and towards stability and sustainability and towards meeting human needs, which are limited, as opposed to human wants, which are unlimited. So the first step would have to be to begin to manage the financial system in order to manage the ecosystem. And that means, in the first instance, that we are going to have to domesticate finance. We are going to have to bring offshore capitalism, which is offshore in order to avoid paying taxes, back on shore, and to use their role in the economy to raise tax revenues, for example, that we need, but also to manage our currency so that it doesn't fluctuate in the way that it does in a financialized system. That will enable us then to use the currency to mobilize the finances that we need, both tax revenues, but also the monetary system, the credit created by the monetary system to finance the transformation. So the first thing we will do is to transform the financial system in order to begin to raise the finance needed to transform the rest of the economy and therefore the ecosystem. For me, there is a very direct link, Steve, between the deregulation of finance and the fact that we have loads of easy money, if you like, which leads to easy shopping, which in turn leads to easy emissions. And it's that trajectory that we have to stop. You know, the fact that I have a credit card and I can go anywhere and I can buy handbags. Right. I mean, I came across a lady once who had bought a handbag for £11,000. You know, that is facilitated by this easy credit system. And it's made worse, if I may say so, and I'm jumping straight into monetary policy here, it's made worse if that easy credit is very expensive. If it's at high rates of interest, I have to earn that much more in order to repay my credit or my debt. And that means I have to extract more assets from A, labour, and B, from the earth. And that's why, that's why Brazil has to strip her forests. And that's why, poor countries have to fish their seas, because they've got to extract those assets to repay their often foreign debts. Right. And the compounding rate of increase in those debts. So that's the system that has to be, if you like, managed before we can manage the expropriation of the Earth's assets.
So just a sort of at the user level, now if you've got voters, they'd be voting essentially for a program which would create a huge number of jobs, transitioning to a zero carbon economy within, let's say, this 10 and a half year time frame, 2030, that we've been given by the IPCC. Yes. So we're talking about, let's say, energy conservation, we're talking about completely new methods of energy production and distribution. Yes. All paid for. How? Well, I mean, now, is it debt or is it tax? Or is it a mixture of both?
It's all paid for by money. Right. We only have money to pay for.
So where's the money coming from?
So the money comes from where it always came from, and where it's come from since 1705, when John Law, that genius of an economist who's much maligned, understood the nature of money. Money is not the thing for which we exchange goods and services. It's not like barter. It's not instead of barter. It's the thing by which we exchange goods and services. And it's also a store of value, of course. And we create money through the banking system, through the private banking system, but also the public banking system. And for example, when it came to the crunch in 2007-9, the public banking system created $1,000 billion, pounds in the case of Britain, and I don't know how many trillions of dollars in the case of the United States, for bailing out the banking system. And it's as well they did, or else we would have all been losing our jobs and rioting in the streets and so on, because we have lost all our money. So that was the right thing to do. What was wrong was the way in which it was implemented. So we create money every time we apply for a loan in the bank. And what would happen is that the firm that is going to be, for example, retrofitting ancient houses that are leaky and energy inefficient, the firms that are going to be doing that, or the government that's going to be doing that, applies for a loan or issues a bond to finance that activity, and in the process invests in retrofitting housing, and by doing so creates jobs, because this is work that has to be done here on the ground in Germany. Can't be done in China, it has to be done here. Okay. And that creates engineers, architects, all kinds of skilled jobs, as well as labourers, as well as manual workers, really. And those people get work. And the great thing about employment, as you and I know from our own experience, is that employment creates income, gives us income. From the government's point of view, the even better thing about employment is that it doesn't just create income for those who are employed, it creates tax revenues for the government, because everyone who's employed, especially if they're on a public contract or if they're on a private contract financed by public authority, they pay taxes, PAYE in the case of the UK. They go shopping for housing or health or education, and those institutions then pay taxes too, and on VAT or whatever, and if they make profits, then they pay taxes on their capital gains. So the government gets back its investment from employment, which pays for the credit in the first instance. And the really important thing is that circle where you create credit, it goes into productive activity, creates jobs, generates income, revenues for government, comes back in the form of debt repayments, and keeps the books stable. I'm deeply in favour of having balanced budgets, but we can't have balanced budgets with unemployment, because unemployment doesn't generate the income and it doesn't generate tax revenues. So the way to balance the books is to create employment.
So is full employment essentially one of the aims or one of the byproducts of a Green New Deal?
For me, this is a labour-intensive project, and this is why I've struggled with the fact, since when we wrote the report back in 2008, we really struggled to get the labour movement to understand that this is for them. We can't. This is work that has to be done here at home, and there's an awful lot of work to do. We have to, in Britain, we have to build flood defences. We're an island, right? We have to make our houses more energy efficient. We have to switch from oil and coal to clean energy. These are huge, skilled and unskilled job creation projects. And the labour movement, above all else, is going to benefit from this. Capitalism may not benefit as much, I'm afraid. So why is it that the labour movement is so loath to? In Britain, what we're finding is that the unions working in the energy sectors are building a cordon around themselves, saying, sorry, we're all about the Green New Deal. It's our jobs that are at stake there. We're going to decide on whether or not we support this or not. And we're saying, sweethearts, you may not be in coal any longer, but you may be in clean energy. They may exactly want your skills. And, we need this transformation. And you will probably, because you're such skilled workers in either the nuclear or the coal industry or the oil industry, you will be valuable to this project. And it's quite hard for them to see that at the moment. All they can see is that their jobs are under threat. Now, I think a Labour government would have to give assurances that we're going to train and upskill our workforce. Britain at the moment has a very big problem with a low-skilled, low-paid, low-grade, effectively, workforce. And capitalism seems content with that because it's immensely profitable. But no Labour government should be satisfied with that. So we should be making promises to train up and upskill the workforce to prepare them for this great transition, which is going to be a labour-intensive transition.
Yeah, and I live in Cologne, which is near the brown coal. It's the
Yes.
largest CO2
Yes.
emitter, the whole of Europe. So this brown coal
Yes.
area where they have this open cast mining, and the unions there have obviously been very resistant
Yeah.
because lots of people involved. Well, actually, it's, this great big machine which digs up the earth, operated just
Yes.
by a handful of guys. But then you've got the power stations, you've got all the sort of service industries around that.
Yes.
And this is an area where structurally there are very few other jobs. But I think that we have to begin with the job guarantee.
Yes, I have reservations about the job guarantee, but can I say this? We have a problem in Britain in that the mining community has a deep, deep distrust of government because of the way in which the miners were treated in the 1980s.
Yeah.
They were kicked out of coal mines and they were abandoned, and their whole communities were just left to go adrift. And it is a crime and a stain on our history, really. And so I'm not surprised that...
Abandoned partly by the Labour Party.
And partly indeed,
strike,
indeed. And so... this is the problem for social democracy, is that it has to regain credibility. At the moment, that trust is not there, and it's about rebuilding the trust with all those coal miners, because of course they need their communities protecting, and of course they need their jobs and their futures protecting, and that's what a Labour government And a social democratic government should be promising
Right.
and delivering.
So moving then beyond all this, wonderful stuff that we'll do, hopefully, to save the planet in time.
Mm-hmm.
How do we pay for it? Because we've had various sort of proposals, and I like to pick them apart a bit. You've got Yanis Varoufakis, who, if I understand this correctly, he wants to issue bonds which are backed up by the central bank who'd be prepared to buy them, which essentially seems to be a form of quantitative easing.
Yeah.
But correct me if I'm wrong. So there was this idea which Richard Murphy had in the UK of a people's quantitative easing, which essentially, some people were saying, well, that's just printing money to pay for stuff you want.
Yeah.
So that seems sort of one hand. On the other hand, you had Thomas Piketty, the French economist, talking much more about taxation, that we should be taxing to do this. Where do you... always the question that comes against any left-wing project is, how are you going to pay for it? Which is perhaps then a whole question of what is money, how is money produced?
Yeah.
How do we get to be able to do these things? We've got all these people who would like to do this work, but how do we get them going?
So Steve, the thing that breaks my heart is the confusion and the muddle that there is around this debate. And you know why? Because the economics profession is standing aloof, saying nothing to do with me, Gov. I may be an economist, but I don't think money is important. I mean, can you imagine a physicist saying, sorry, gravity has got nothing to do with me. I concern myself with this tiny little patch of the physical world. Well, that's what our economists are doing. And as a result, there's really a lot of muddled debate.
So you mean that the microeconomists looking at...
the microeconomist, there's an economist at the BIS who explained it well. He said, you're standing on the beach and the waves are splashing in at your feet, and someone says to you, what's causing the tides to rise? And here in the waves there's a shoal of fish, and they're spinning around at a tremendous rate. And the microeconomist says, well, let's start by counting all these fish and just looking at the rate at which they spin, right? And you're busy, engrossed in this process. And the macroeconomist says, sweetheart, what you should be doing is looking at the moon. Right. And that's the difference between micro and macroeconomics, right? And there's most of today's economists are these microeconomists, right? And they've left the big issue of money alone. Now, the thing is, it means going back to basics, if you don't mind. So first of all money is created as credit in the first instance. And the reason for that is historic, and we won't go into that. But if you want a loan of 300,000 euros to buy, I don't know, a shed somewhere in Munich, then it would have to be a shed. Then you go to the bank, and there is no money in the bank when you apply. This idea that the bank has got Mrs. Schäuble's savings in their vault, and she's going to lend them to you, that is nonsense, right? And the whole idea in monetarist and conservative economics, and indeed in a lot of German economics, is the idea that you've got to first of all build up the savings, and then you can spend. Right. You can't possibly spend before you've built up the savings. Now, we all kind of tended to go along with that until somebody found £1,000 billion to bail out the banks from nowhere, So when you go to the bank, there's no money in the bank. The bank says, have you got collateral? And you say, yes, I've already own a shed somewhere else. Right. And you offer that up as collateral. And they say, will you sign this contract and promise to pay? And by the way, this is underpinned by the law, and if you don't, you'll go to jail. And thirdly, will you agree to a rate of interest over a period of time for the repayment of this loan? And you say that you agree to that. So it's not a simple matter of printing money. It's a swap, if you like, of a collateral in exchange for a contract. And the minute you do that, the banker goes to his computer in the bank and enters numbers into a computer and transfers it to your account, just like that, magic, right? But, there's been a painful process before that. You've handed over your collateral, you've promised to pay, you've committed your future income, to the bank and so on. And that is how all money is created. It is created like that at a micro level with commercial banks, and at a macro level for the central bank. Now, the central bank's clients are the big institutions, the financial institutions, banks and big pension funds and so on. The clients for the commercial bank are micro borrowers individuals and firms, right? But that's how all money is created. So there's a lovely story about Ben Bernanke, which I'm afraid I tell endlessly, who the Fed promised AIG, which had an account.
So Ben Bernanke was the chairman of
Ben Bernanke was the governor of the Federal Reserve and gave the first ever interview a governor's ever given. And in the interview was given the day after he'd put $85 billion into the bank account of AIG, which was an insurance company and should not have had an account with the Fed. But anyway, and the journalist says to him, now, Mr. Bernanke, where did you get $85 billion from? And he says, did you get it from taxpayers? And he says, no. We have at the Federal Reserve something that every commercial bank has, which is a computer. And I entered 11 digits into the computer and transferred it to AIG. And that is how all money is made. So to talk about printing money is to suggest that there is no process of exchange of collateral and assets and so on. And that's why I'm against the talk of print. A people's QE means there's a machine that spews out money and with no process. The second reason I'm against people's QE is that it gives the central bank staff, who are all civil servants, technocrats, immense power to decide, sorry, I'm going to dole out money and I'm going to put in so-and-so's bank account. I mean, first of all, what if we don't have a bank account? What if we don't have, and the fact that we're giving technocrats the power to issue money and to put it into our bank accounts or into anybody's bank accounts, for me, is abominable. I don't like it at all. This has to be a democratic process. The government, in my view, has to issue a bond, has to borrow. And in issuing the bond, does what you and I do, promises to pay over a period of time, offers collateral, and the collateral for the bank, for the government is, by the way, I've got 30 million taxpayers or 60 million taxpayers behind me, and I promise to pay over a period of time, and in exchange is given liquidity. So there's always this process, and the process, as it is at the moment, for example, in Britain, is transparent. I can see every time the government issues a bond. I can find out. There's public knowledge. The government can't do this in private without me knowing. And I've worked in Nigeria, where the government is not independent, and the central bank is not independent, and the politicians periodically dip their fingers into the central bank's coffers. No, it's got to be transparent. And the central bank can play a very positive part in buying those bonds off the market and helping to keep their price, keep their yield, their interest rate on those bonds low.
So that's what Draghi's been doing in the European Central Bank.
Yeah, and I think that's fine. The question is what bonds is Draghi buying, and whether or not they're safe and all of that. There's lots of process in that. But the fact is that's how all money is created, whether it's called, we called it quantitative easing because we just discovered it, in fact, but central banks have been doing that since the Bank of England was founded in 1694. So I want a democratic government or a government to make the decision about spending, not technocrats at the central bank. So I'm against printing money, and I have disagreements with both MMT but also People's QE about that.
MMT, modern monetary theory.
Modern monetary theory.
Which is a small but very vocal group.
Very vocal, painfully vocal. So this is part of the muddle, and then the question becomes, how much of can the government borrow? And the capacity of the government to borrow is pretty much like yours. How much can the government expect to earn over 30 years? How much can you expect to earn over 30 years? If you're a university academic in a safe job and you know roughly what your wage is going to be over 30 years, you can take out more than someone who lives on the streets and doesn't have any kind of guaranteed future income or professional status or whatever. So there are decisions to be made about the capacity. And then when the government does borrow, as I said earlier, if it invests in employment and generates the revenues to repay that debt, it keeps the whole system stable and in equilibrium. And that's really the important thing. Now the question is, employment creates income, and I would like to see taxes to rise by employing more people. That's the best way to raise taxes, is to increase employment. But we may also want to tax the rich more, and I'm deeply in favour. Above all, we want to tax Apple and Starbucks and Google and all of those guys who make their money here and then whoosh it out of the country effortlessly. and dodge taxation. Right. And I just think we've got to put a stop to that.
There was the EU digital tax, which was mooted, and which unfortunately has been stopped by an SPD finance minister in Germany.
Yeah. And this is about the corruption of our politics by the financial system, by Wall Street and the City of London and Frankfurt and so on. You know, we've got a very big problem with our political system. It has been really. Today I'm reading about Mr. Schäuble's lunch with the Financial Times. And his candidate for the leadership, for the chancellorship of his party, was a BlackRock employee. BlackRock is sitting on $6.5 trillion of the world's savings, our pensions. And they're wandering around the world unregulated, unmanaged, spending that money and capturing governments. And I just feel, Mr. Schäuble is naive beyond belief to believe that someone who is a BlackRock employee is going to allow a government to tax BlackRock. Of course they're not,
I don't know if he's naive. I think it's part of the plan.
Maybe part of the plan.
But so to go back to, I remember being very struck when I read Thomas Piketty's Capital in the 21st Century. It took me a bit of time, but I got through it.
Good for you.
Piketty, which is, and he's a classical economist, but he makes a point which really stuck with me, is that if the government had a choice between taxing or raising money through issuing bonds, what you're doing with issuing bonds is you're going to rich people and saying, please can we borrow your money, and we promise to make you richer by giving you more money back. Now, at the moment that's not true, because in Germany, the 10-year bonds have actually now gone into negative interest, so actually Germany could be borrowing money and making a profit out of it, which makes, we can talk about the German debt brake in a minute. Yeah. But in normal cases that's the case. The German government or any government would be paying interest. That's making investors buying those bonds richer, and that's an essentially capitalist thing of investors, through the fact of them becoming rich, have a right to become richer. Mm-hmm. And the alternative, Piketty says, well, rather than borrow the money off them and make them richer, just tax them in the first place. Is that not in itself enough? Why is Piketty wrong, or is he wrong?
He's wrong because, first of all, that isn't enough money for what we need. And secondly, because the people issuing bonds may be rich. There's certainly some very rich people amongst them. But what there are also are pension funds. I put my pension, my savings into a fund in the hope that in 30 years' time, actually, I hope that 30 years ago, that when I had
you're going to retire in 30 years time,
that I would have some money to live on today. In fact, my investment proved not to be terribly sound.
Well, but perhaps we should talk about British and German, because in German we still have a state pension which people pay into.
Yes, no, exactly. So that even if we have a state pension, we are putting our savings into a box. Now, what is happening to those savings, and what are we going to have in 30 years' time? What we could do, if you were the state finance minister, is take those pensions and invest them in some private sector enterprise. But we all know that's risky. We want our pensions to be secure for us in 30 years' time. And so the question is this, that the way in which the financial system now is deregulated. And so what Piketty is talking about is this deregulated system. I'm a Keynesian, and Keynes had this idea which in my view is revolutionary, but is ignored by economists precisely because it is revolutionary. And that is that when we save money, we have several instincts. We may have, for example, you might sell your shed and have 300,000 euros and think, oh dear, what am I going to do with this? I'm terribly worried if I put it in the bank. Right. Not all of it is guaranteed, and after all, the bank might go bust and so on. So that is, I have a cash motive. I want to be able to draw that cash down quite quickly, but I need somewhere safe to put it. So that's called the cash motive. And then there's the precautionary motive, which is that I've got 300,000 euros and I want in 30 years' time to be able to have some of that money back again to live on. So where do I put it in order to, in 30 years' time, still have value? And then there's another part of me that thinks, why shouldn't I use this money to speculate? I go and buy myself a London property or a Berlin property, right, and hope that the price will rise because somebody has told me that the prices will never fall for Berlin properties. And so those are the three motives that savers have.
Right.
And Keynes argued that what the state should do is provide assets, i.e. bonds, which meet those motives. And by doing that, they would provide the cash motive, the precautionary motive, and the speculative motive with a safe place to put their money.
Right.
And by doing that, the state would A, protect those savings, and B, would then be able to offer a rate of interest on all those three categories of savings, which would then dominate the whole economy and lower interest rates across the spectrum of borrowing and lending. And I believe personally that low interest rates are terribly important for an economically and ecologically sustainable economy. So, I think Piketty is wrong to say that, we're all capitalists. Many of us are just savers and want a decent return on our money. We don't want a massive return on our money. Unfortunately, the bond markets have been captured by Wall Street in the city of London and Frankfurt, and they take all those pensions and all those savings and make masses of money out of them. And sure, we should be doing something about that. But if you say that we're going to finance everything through taxation, then number one, there are not enough rich people to raise the money, believe it or not, to raise the finance needed for this transformation. And secondly, it'll probably mean there'll be a lot of ordinary people that will be taxed as well. And so the problem with Piketty's idea is that taxation takes money out of the economy and gives it to the state. And at a time when there's not enough, right now, Germany and Europe as a whole is suffering from effectively deflation. Right. And taking more money out of a deflating economy through taxation is to contract even further the amount of money in the economy. And when there's just a small amount of money in the economy, the whole economy contracts, and this is, and so that is a problem. So I don't agree with Piketty on that point.
So to your argument would essentially, by creating debt, we are also creating credit. We're increasing the supply of money. I remember in my childhood the sort of terrible tones of Margaret Thatcher echoing in my ears. If there's too much money, it loses value.
Yes.
But in fact, what we actually want to do is, that's exactly what we want. We want to increase the volume of money, which actually would, through inflation, would actually diminish the value of the assets of those who are already very wealthy.
So the thing is this, that if you borrow too much money,
right, inflation,
and if you create too much credit,
right,
which is what we've been doing for the last 30 years, we've been able to go to the bank and say, oh, I've got a crazy idea, give me loads of money, I want to buy a £11,000 handbag, can I please have a credit card for that? Right. The bank said, yeah, of course you can, we know you're going to earn money on that handbag. It happened to be a pink crocodile skin handbag. The thing is,
I want one.
So the thing is, the bank said, yeah, have the money, here's the credit card, right? That's crazy. And that's caused inflation of the prices of certain things, and in particular of assets.
Especially property.
Oh, especially property, because that's speculative.
No.
So that's because what's happened to that credit, that easy credit, is that it's gone into existing assets. And land is a finite and existing asset. You can't, we don't grow new land every day, right? And as a result of pushing money at that fixed, finite asset, we've pushed up the price, right? So we've had the system of just creating far too much credit and aiming it at existing assets and not in creating new assets, because that's risky to create something, to build a new wind farm. God knows whether that'll be profitable. No, I'm going to invest in land or property. So there is an issue if you create too much credit that it leads to inflation. Equally, if you create too little, that leads to deflation. Now, inflation erodes the value of debt, which is why bankers, the finance sector, the establishment hate inflation.
And Piketty's point in the book is actually that the post-war debt, the huge post-war debt that was incurred by this orgy of destruction, was essentially eradicated by inflation.
Well, it wasn't actually. He's wrong about the immediate post-war period. There wasn't very high inflation. Many neoclassical economists argue that. The inflation starts in the 70s when we start to pump up too much credit, when we deregulate the finance system and the bankers go crazy lending crazy money, right? But the point is that with deflation, you contract the money supply. But what that does, and why the bankers love deflation, is that it increases the value of debt effortlessly.
Yeah.
When I had a mortgage in the 70s when there was inflation, and my mortgage shrank relative to my income, it was wonderful. And in the end it disappeared virtually, right? Now, my wage is falling and my debt is rising. And the bankers love that, which is why we have deflation in Europe, right? We have a banker's economy. So we've got to get the balance right. So we can't have inflation, we can't have deflation.
Okay, so
that's the tough thing that the public authorities have to manage.
Yeah, so my head's spinning a little bit because
Yes.
you're the economist and I'm not.
Yeah.
So we've got this situation where actually far too much debt has been created.
Yeah.
We're over-leveraged. Even Germany, which is meant to be this incredibly healthy economy,
Yeah.
is way over the Maastricht level. Maastricht said we should have 60% of GDP as debt. And we have huge public debt, we have huge private debt.
Yeah.
What you're saying, however, is we should create new debt, but which is not as, let's say, a householder or the Swabian housewife going out to buy a pink crocodile skin handbag,
Yeah.
but she's going actually to build a factory which is going to make stuff.
Exactly. So the point is, the reason why, it's so interesting. So during the war, we spent crazy money on a destructive activity, which is to kill each other and destroy land and assets. And we ended up with, because we could generate no income from those destroyed assets, a huge amount of credit went into financing the war and we were left with this debt. What happened in Britain was that immediately a Labour government began to spend crazy money.
Right.
They spent money on building houses, they built a national education system, they built the National Health Service, they employed they nationalised the mines, they employed millions of people, and wow,
and
what
steel
happens?
And
all of that.
Auto construction.
And boom, the debt falls, right? So that's the problem with the Swabian housewife. Her savings are not like the government savings. Unlike the government, she can't do what the Labour government did in 1945, which is to say to the central bank, please help me spend money, I'm going to borrow some money, because I want to employ all these soldiers who gave their lives or offered their lives and now are unemployed. I want to give them work, right? And the bank got to and helped the government do that. The bank doesn't do that for the Swabian housewife. It can do it for a government, because those soldiers, by being employed, are going to pay taxes, and the bank knows that, and the government's going to get their money back. So that's why the system has to work that way, and why, this number of 60% is a totally arbitrary number. Even 90%, the ghastly Rogoff number is just illogical.
This is Rogoff, who had
Kenneth
a sort of
Rogoff. Professor Kenneth Rogoff from Harvard University.
Around the time of, is it 2008? Post then, he was sort of celebrated as great saviour, and he'd worked out that 90% of GDP, everything falls apart.
Yeah.
It turns out his Excel spreadsheet
was wrong.
No,
they cheated. But it wasn't even that. It's that his economics is wrong. I was at a conference that he spoke at one of the INET, Institute of New Economics, and I asked him, look, there's a period, 1945 to 1970, where the debt falls dramatically, and where there are no financial crises. How do you explain that? Oh, he said, you can't explain that. No, that was socialism. He can't see that. Anyway, it was incredibly damaging what he said, because Paul Ryan in the US Congress said we have to now cut spending.
Right.
And George Osborne said, yes, Mr. Rogoff, please can I quote you in all my speeches? Now I'm going to smash up the British state. And so at a time when private activity contracts, Mr. Osborne contracts public activity as well. So by contracting both private and public sector activity, you shrink your economy into what you have today, which is an economy with high levels of debt and no income coming in to repay it.
So let's talk about So the Keynesian project is essentially counter-cyclical, that in times of recession, and it takes on board that we go through boom and bust, and at times of bust, then the government has to get in there to prime the pump, as Roosevelt put it, to start spending, to get economic activity going again.
Yes.
And we have these, the Trente Glorieuses, the 30 fantastic years of the post-war, of a sort of a Keynesian consensus, which does seem to deliver much more equal outcomes not for everybody, and there are issues, but for large swathes of the population. New Deal wasn't very good, let's say, for African Americans.
There was a lot of bad mistakes.
But and at some point in the 70s, this kind of all goes kaput. And within Labour now, I think, we're obviously talking about Keynesian economics, we want to go back to that. But we had this stagflation, where it seemed that kind of the wheels fell off, and this model, which had been working, ceases to function.
Yeah.
And you have all these crises. Now, I was too young then to really... what happened? Why did these 30 years come to a close?
Two things, and I want to move on, if I can, to Europe in a minute.
All right.
First of all, Bretton Woods was not a deal that Keynes really wanted.
So Bretton Woods was a system of capital and currency controls.
No, Bretton Woods was a plan which was drafted by economists. It was so lovely. Roosevelt refused to allow a single banker to attend the Bretton Woods conference. It was only economists, led by Keynes and White. This is 1944, just before the end of the war, right? And the idea is to create a new financial architecture, because Keynes understood the international financial system. I'd love to tell you the story of Germany and Keynes in 1919, and I will in a minute. But he understood that for a domestic economy to function, you need the international environment, economy, architecture to function as well. And he did not want a single dominant reserve currency to be managed by a single imperial power.
So Keynes wanted the Bankor, right, as a sort of...
He wanted an international clearing union.
Right.
And in Europe post-war, in 1948 or 49, we introduced the European Payments Union here, which was the foundation of the recovery of Europe from the war. Not Marshall Aid, but the European payment system. And I'd love to talk about that in a minute.
I've never heard of that.
No, exactly. 48 to 59. Right. And it was a superb piece of financial architecture for helping countries to trade with each other and keep themselves in balance. And he wanted that system. And what happened was that they drafted the Bretton Woods Agreement, and there were lines ... that he did not see before publication, and that Mr. White filled in, and the dollar became the dominant economy. He did so. Yeah. So that's a big problem. But even so, even with that big mistake, the Bretton Woods period is an era known by all economists as the Golden Age. In the late 60s, the euro dollar is invented, and this is a scheme by private banks to upend the system of the international financial architecture, which was an architecture for managing flows across borders, trade and financial, to keep them stable. That's all he wanted. He said, if you get to a situation where one country has a massive surplus and another a massive deficit, you create the conditions for war, for trade wars.
Which is exactly
where we
Germany's
are
position
now.
today,
Exactly.
8%.
So the point is, he said, let's try and keep balance so we never again have to have a world war. Boy, we ignored him then, we're ignoring him today.
Well, I don't think Germany's about to...
No, China and trade. China and the United States, for goodness sake. We're now in a situation where we have a trade war between China and the United States. This is not pretty, this is not good. And Keynes was very keen to have some sort of balance. And inside Europe, we have massive imbalances. Germany has a surplus and other countries have a deficit. And this is creating the tensions in Europe, which in my view lead to political problems. And Keynes was profoundly committed to preventing that from happening. He failed in that respect. And then in the late 1960s, the bankers tried to break open the system that he had set up, which had some management of capital flows across borders. And they invented the euro dollar for that purpose. And then in 1971, we get in Britain and in the United States a system for removing regulation of the banks and removing ceilings on interest rates. And the world goes mad, and we get inflation of too much money chasing too few goods and services at a time of full employment, right? And that was inflationary. And who got the blame for that? Keynes. So stagflation is blamed on Keynes. And that, for me, is such an injustice, really, because the stagflation that we get under Anthony Barber in Britain and then Margaret Thatcher...
So this is stagflation, is increases in unemployment and inflation.
Yes.
Before they'd been considered to be a seesaw, but at that point they both start going.
Yes,
yeah.
And that's because of financial deregulation. And Keynes was deeply, deeply against that.
But why did this financial deregulation, I think some Marxist economists would argue, well, actually it's the falling rate of profit, that actually this financial deregulation was in order to try and increase profits or to assure profits at a time when they were naturally declining.
I don't agree with that at all. So what was happening was that the that the City of London, largely helped by Wall Street, had discovered that they could break the rules essentially. And what they want to do more than anything else is not earn money by dirtying their hands and starting projects and extracting and engaging with the land and with labour. That is tiresome capitalism work. That's what old-fashioned Marxist capitalists used to do. They don't do that no more. No, they sit on their butts with a computer screen in front of them and they lend money to some poor country or poor individual, and they charge them interest rates of very high real terms, and wow, the rent just keeps coming in, right? And in the meantime, they fold their arms and do nothing. Now, your old-fashioned capitalist, I travelled through Mannheim to come here.
Right.
Now, Mannheim, for me, is good old-fashioned industrial capitalism that most Marxists, have been in contest with, if you like.
Right.
We don't have that anymore. Nobody would be so crazy as to establish a Siemens industry right now under today's capitalism.
Right.
Instead, what do? You go to Frankfurt and you bone up on some physics and you do a bit of work on algorithms and you sit at a computer and you lend money or you you own existing assets. You might have an existing bond, which is a government bond, and you might lend it or you'll use it to extract rent from someone else. And rent seeking means that I can make capital gains at rates which make the old Siemens industrialist look pathetic. So I think what happened in the 1970s was industrialists were making profits, and profits, as we all know, are volatile. They go up and down. You have a strike or some problem goes, you have climate crisis, or whatever. And these are your rates of profit. Capital gains rise exponentially, If you think about the lottery, you make capital gains when you invest in the lottery. You may lose your money, but you may make $1 million overnight, right? Effortlessly. And capitalists today much prefer the speculative gains made from rent seeking than the profits made from the hard work of the Mannheimers of this world. So, they are the past. What we're dealing with now is a form of financial capitalism. So what happened in the 1970s, it seems to me, was that the financial capitalists looked at the real economy and thought, God, they're not making capital gains at the same rate as we make when we lend money effortlessly. What are we going to do? And the OECD invented in 1963, I think it was, the term growth. And they set a target for the British economy to rise by 50%, to expand by 50% over 10 years. Because they wanted that kind of exponential growth to come from the real economy as well as from the financial economy, to compete with the financial economy. I remember reading about board members on McDonald's board saying, God, you're not making enough profits out of these hamburgers, you're digging wheat out of the fields and meat and all of that, so putting it together, you're hiring all these people, and your profits kind of stay at this sort of rate. Well, if I take my money and I put it in the City of London, I can make 10 times as much. Why should I give you money? And so you find the old McDonald's capitalist having to compete with the financial capitalist. And what does he do? So he cuts his labour force, he extracts more money more assets from the earth, he makes sure that the cows are far more productive, or whatever these scams they have to do to keep up with this rate of return. So far from the rate of profit declining, the rate of profit is forced into competition with capital gains, and that's basically unsustainable.
So speculative rent-seeking capitalism is simply, in the short term, more profitable than what maybe then Maria Mazzucato's, is that how you pronounce it? Mazzucato's work sort of showing that actually state investment in productive technology is actually where you achieve genuine productive growth.
So you look at Mr. Jobs, Steve Jobs, he invents something called he says he invents something called the iPhone. He did nothing whatsoever. All he did was to take all the inventions made by, as she chose so clearly, all the inventions made by the public sector, by the US defense industry, financed by US taxpayers. They invented the internet, they invented all the key elements of the iPhone. He takes all of that for free, turns it into something called the iPhone, and then flogs it internationally and makes us all pay 700 quid for this thing. Meantime, the taxpayers have already financed its invention, and there's nothing truly innovative about him, except the fact that he's been smart enough to grab these public assets and turn them into private gains.
So we said we're going to talk about Europe, and we go. Nationalise iPhones. I'm all for that. I think public control of data. It's another conversation. You wanted to talk about Europe. We've gone into a lot of detail, and we should, because now I'm not an economist, but what I did think I understood of Keynes was that capital controls were absolutely essential part of the system, as well as avoiding trade surpluses, which is the massive imbalance we have in Europe today. Now you are, for instance, very against Brexit. But we have, of course, a system in Europe where 4 freedoms, which, beyond the thing of, I like, being friends with lots of different people from different countries. I like travelling on trains and not stopping on borders. It's very convenient to pay in the same currency in different countries. And I'm not particularly interested in nationalism where people who come from the same country by birth are somehow better than other people. But we do have a Europe of 4 freedoms, and one of which is the freedom of movement of capital. And we have large parts of, say, northern England where capital has simply left, and the factories have been built elsewhere where labour is cheaper and exploitation works better, and industrial standards, employment standards, environmental standards are worse. So a Europe which guarantees the free movement of capital. If we have, let's say, a Labour government comes to power and wants to put a lot of restrictions on capital, wants to tax the wealthy, even to tax wealth, the wealth tax becomes a big thing, we know what the reaction will be. And it seems to have been, that was the case with Mitterrand in 1981 as well. The money just flees the country as quick as it can. And these days it can flee extremely quickly. And just literally a push of a button and it's gone. And yet these free movement of capital is programmed into the European Union. Now, so there are people on the Lexit spectrum who would say, well, this is the fundamental thing because we cannot democratically vote that out. This is anchored in the European treaties. What do we do? So how do you reconcile being a Keynesian economist who I think is in favour of capital controls with being a pro-European who is against Brexit, and how do we reform Europe? What's the plan?
So the point is, this journey on Brexit has been a painful one for me because I've been a Eurosceptic. In 1975, before you were born, I reckon, Steve. No. Really, I campaigned against joining the EU. Right. My neighbour worked for a big Vesties, the big meat company in Britain, and the employers told him if he didn't vote for Europe, he'd be out. And I thought this was just, big business. And I was right.
But historically, the Labour left of that era were almost all.
Exactly. So I'm against, this is what I find appalling about the German government's approach to economics. The idea that you embed in concrete economic policy. Economic policy is a flexible thing. It is something that has to respond to, think of a law in Mozambique today where the whole economy is destroyed by a weather event. And you say, I'm terribly sorry, but it's the law that we should do nothing about this. I mean, this is like irrational human behaviour. So policy has to be to respond to conditions. And by embedding it in the concrete of treaties, you're saying we can't possibly change policy. It's a kind of suicide.
This is kind of the way that Europe works, and this is the tragedy of Greece. Well, you've entered into all these agreements, and you have to repay however you vote.
And I'm afraid, it is a policy that's imposed by the finance sector, because the finance sector believes that public sector crowds out private sector money, and that if you don't force Greece into this, you're not going to be able to have capital mobility across the world, and you want to be able to lend crazy money to Greece whenever you do, without any inhibition, and expect Germans to repay you when it all goes badly wrong. That's what you want as a financier. And so you make it so that whether it's Greece or the German taxpayer, that you, the bank, never lose, and the politicians make sure you get your money back, right? So you embed these laws, it is criminal, really. So the point is this, that so I have a problem because I'm so clear about European policy, but for me this is not an economic issue any longer. This is now a profoundly important political and environmental issue. We have the rise of fascism across Europe, really. I mean, whether we call it that or we call it far-right nationalism or authoritarianism, it is scary as hell. And we cannot deal with that on a sort of nationalist basis. The idea of left nationalism is so inappropriate right now, basically. And furthermore, we have a climate crisis. And we're at Britain, we're a little island. You know, the weather is not an island. The weather isn't confined to our boundaries. So we need alliances across Europe to tackle fascism, to tackle financial liberalisation, and to tackle climate change. And the idea that there are people on the left in Britain and in some of the leadership positions in Britain that think we must now go isolationist and join the far right of the Tory party to align ourselves with the far right of the Republican Party in the United States and have what is called free marketeering. I can't believe that there are people on the left doing that. And so what this is a political
would you include
issue.
that? And, you know, you've got Bernie Sanders and the American left, for instance, who have always been very critical of NAFTA and free trade areas.
Yeah.
Would you include them in that as well?
Whoever
Because it seems to be, you know, to be opposed to the free movement to capital is not the same as being a fascist or a nationalist.
No. Well, I don't know. I mean...
So is the free movement of capital essentially a socialist?
I think
project?
so. What you're seeing, I mean, let's go back to Polanyi, really. Polanyi understood all this stuff. Polanyi argued that if you have self-regulating markets out there, running the world, governing the world, saying this is the value of your currency, this is how much rate of interest must be, this is how much you must spend on public sector investment, and then you turn to your government, the Social Democrats, and you say, please, can you help us? Because, you know, our children can't go to university, we can't afford to buy a home, our jobs are low paid, and they've been held down for ages, please help us. And the Social Democrats, sorry, no, that the market decides all that, right? When that happens, and the people look at the market, and the market is this unaccountable remote being that they can't elect or vote out, they look to a strong man, and it's invariably a man, except in the case of France, to protect them from these market forces, which have caused them to have their wages repressed, etc., etc. And so we see Trump. Trump promises to protect American workers from Mexican low-paid workers. He's going to build a wall. That's protectionism, right? He's going to protect them from China. We see Orbán doing the same.
After 2008, after Hungarian...
Yeah, we see all of that. Yeah. Now, that protectionism is a reaction against total liberalisation. It's about protect me, please, because I feel threatened. I feel really exposed by these markets. And so the question isn't to hammer the people because they're afraid, it's to hammer the system, which has created that insecurity and the volatility. And it is for social democrats to take responsibility and not to leave responsibility for these things to something called the market, which is invisible and unaccountable, you know. So for me, that is the very big problem. And the idea that we should favour some kind of nationalism on the left, is not the answer at the moment. But
leaving nationalism aside, how does a Keynesian project work without capital control?
So it doesn't. I mean, the fact of the matter is, I'm working with a bunch of Italian economists, wonderful, Massimo Amato and Luca Fantacci, and they have. Please, everyone, I ask everyone to look up Luca Fantacci and Massimo Amato's work on the internet. And they've been looking at the way in which Europe managed after the war and the European payment system that was set up. And this was a system which enabled... So what happened after the war was nobody had any money. And the Americans said, we might drop some Marshall aid on you and help you out. That wasn't enough to keep the thing going, to finance recovery. You know, Europe was demolished, essentially. Right. That wasn't enough to finance recovery. And so this economist Robert Triffin thought up this proposal. So what had happened was Belgium did a deal with Holland to have trade credits and just simply to pay, we'll sell you, I don't know, tomatoes in exchange for your olive oil, and then we'll pay each other that way. But that confined us into sort of all these bilateral agreements which we made with lots of other countries. What we lacked was a currency that would enable us to trade not just with Belgium, but with other countries in Europe, really, and begin to sell and buy things. We would need things, you know, we'd need machinery from Germany, or Germany would need blah. So what they needed was a currency. But that currency had to be managed, and it was managed. And it was managed so that it was just like a bank, or just like the central bank operates in a country. The central bank operates by ordinary banks doing deals every day, you know, accepting credits and debits. And at the end of the day, they may be in deficit or in surplus, and the central bank helps them out to keep their books in balance. But just says to them, don't get too far out of balance, because then we won't be able to help you out. So in the same way, the currency operated with a central institution which enabled all of these countries to trade with each other. But the rules were, thou shalt not develop a huge surplus, and if you do, then we'll penalise you. You'll have to pay interest on that surplus. Secondly, thou shalt not develop a huge deficit, and if you do, you shall pay interest on that deficit, and that interest will go to the surplus countries, and so on. So what it did was it penalised both surplus and deficit countries, and helped to keep things stable between them, so that the surplus country, the Germany of those days, say, would then be forced to buy Spanish lemons in order for the Spanish to be able to buy washing machines, and so on. But then fundamental to that was the movement of capital across the borders of the currency, across the borders of the currency, and that was managed. It wasn't controlled, it was managed. Essentially, the capital controls means taxes on revenues flowing, you know, sand in the wheels. It's the financial transaction tax. I don't take your money away. I simply tax you if you're moving your money too quickly, or if it's going into speculative activity or whatever. So it's different from exchange controls. People mix up the two things. Capital controls are a tax on revenues across borders, and exchange controls tells you how much currency you can take out of the country. But that's a different thing. So all it did was to tax these revenues as they flowed across, and that inhibited speculative activity and so on. And it was the basis of recovery after the war, you know, far more than Marshall Aid was. And I think we need to, because we now have a Eurozone, if we moved from the current system, which is based on, you know, an unaccountable central bank and massive imbalances, if we moved back to a European payment system, I think we could stabilise Europe again. We could still keep the European dream of we all want to work together, we want to live in peace, we never want another world war, which is the fundamental driving force behind Europe. If we could keep all that, but we would have a more stable payment system within Europe, and we would manage our relationships with external finance.
Does that mean a new reserve currency?
No, it could be the same currency. We have it already.
Still be the dollar.
And what Fantacci and Amatu argue is that Target 2 balances, which are managed by the ECB, already is that thing. Really, we already have a system where the central banks, you know, manage the deficits and the credits and the debts of the banks overnight, and so on and so forth. And in Target 2 balances, the Germans have got a massive surplus and others have deficits. And there is no penalty for doing that. There's no penalty for the deficit and no penalty for the surplus. If you introduced a system of sanctions, which would encourage Germany to do more trade within Europe, then you might find that we could do it within the existing framework and stabilise balances between countries. So I find that that means that we don't have to break up Europe, we don't have to start from scratch, we already have a framework, and we could just change it, really. And it's a sort of thing that economists and monetary theorists and monetary policy makers could do, you know, in a way that, for example, engineers know the answers to how to build bridges, and I really don't want to learn about how to build a bridge, really. Can I
just want to get over it.
Please, can I make sure that you've just built a bridge that is safe and isn't going to cause division in Europe? Please, could you just do that? And that's, I think we should, but that requires our economists and our monetary theorists and policies to have the vision and the grasp, the understanding. But we've got 2 Italians who are giving us the answer already.
So just to finish, because we've been into so much detail, we have Germany operating on the model of a Swabian housewife. We've got austerity imposed through the Maastricht conditions on most of southern Europe. We have millions and millions of people unemployed, especially young people. We have a planet which is facing climate collapse. Where could we be, say by 2030, which is this magic date where we really have to have achieved these climate targets by then? Where could we be with a Green New Deal, with a European payment system? How, in the most positive outcome, how would things look? In just a couple of bullet points.
Well, I think, you know, the first thing we need is political leadership. And I mean, the question is, how do we get that? How do we find ourselves someone with the vision and the compassion and the wit and the intelligence to fix our bridges, right? So that we can have bridges between countries. And secondly, how do we find someone that has the vision to understand that we must do this with a great urgency? Because our future, you know, it's not even our children's future, it's our own futures. I hope to live for another 10 years. But in 10 years' time, we could have devastated the climate. We could be, our world could be unlivable. That's how urgent it is. Now, in 1938, when we thought we might have to go to war, we were a bit slow in Britain to prepare, right? But when it came to the moment, we did. We transformed our economy overnight. The central bank found the money. The taxation system was changed. Women were mobilised and brought into the workforce overnight. I have to say that overnight they were also kicked out of the workforce when the men came back. But the point was, we're capable. You know, the thing about us is that we are such clever creatures, really. We are capable of making these very big decisions in a very short time. So, you know, we need leadership. We've got all the institutions we need. We're going to have to transform our industries. We're going to have to get rid of dirty industries and replace them with clean industries. We can do that. We know we can do that. We could bail out the coal industry. We could bail out the oil industry. We'd find ways of satisfying all those people. You know, when we ended the slave trade, we had to compensate all the slave owners. And somehow or other, the British government found the money to compensate the slave owners. So don't tell me it can't be done. It is done.
We didn't compensate the slaves.
We didn't compensate the slaves, but you know, the fact of the matter is we've made great transformations and we've sorted that out. So let's have the confidence and the hope and discover the power that we have for a transformational Green New Deal.
So maybe then the crisis really is the chance. Naomi Klein's great point is actually here because the crisis is so great that we can finally have the courage to take a genuinely radical course of action. I'd add on, as well as the leadership, we need the movement which is demanding that. And we see, and we had just a week and a half ago, 300,000 kids out on school strike in Germany alone.
Wow.
And I think 1.6 million worldwide. So kids, well done.
Yes.
But Anne, thank you. Thank you for fighting for the ideas, the framework that maybe a movement really can build, not just in Germany or in the UK, but worldwide to demand these changes. Thank you very much.
Thank you.